The first thing anyone heard was the snap. Not a shout, not a warning. A hard, flat snap of plastic against metal as a boarding pass was folded, once, twice, and slid back across the counter like a rejected document at a courthouse window. The gate agent did not look up. "Sir," she said, voice thin and final, "you're not cleared to board this flight." The man standing there did not argue. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood very still, as if the words had not yet finished traveling through him. Behind him, the jet bridge hummed. Ahead of him, the glass door to the aircraft reflected his face, older than most of the people rushing past, calm in a way that unsettled the agent more than anger would have. His name was Thomas Reed. He was 67 years old. And in less than 2 hours, half the people in this terminal would wish they had paid closer attention to the way he breathed when he was told no. The gate was crowded in the familiar American way. Business travelers with rolling bags, retirees heading west for grandchildren and sunshine. A woman in a beige trench coat stood to the side, arms crossed, watching with faint irritation, as if delays were personal insults. Her name was Carol Henley, 61, senior vice president at a regional investment firm, accustomed to moving through lines like weather through open air. "This is ridiculous," Carol said, not to anyone in particular. "We've already boarded half the cabin." The gate agent glanced up then, relief flickering across her face at the presence of someone who looked like authority. "Ma'am, we're just resolving a clearance issue." Thomas Reed turned slightly. His eyes met Carol's for a moment. Not challenging, not pleading. Observant. He smelled faintly of winter wool and old paper. His coat was neatly pressed, but worn at the cuffs, the kind of coat that had been repaired instead of replaced. "I've flown this route for 20 years, Carol continued, tapping her phone. "There's no reason for this delay." Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it again. He reached into his inside pocket slowly, deliberately, and removed a small envelope. Inside was a folded letter, creased so many times it had softened at the edges. He held it between 2 fingers, hesitated, then slid it back where it came from. "I can step aside," he said quietly. His voice was steady, low. "If you need the space." The gate agent exhaled, grateful. "Thank you, sir. Please wait near the podium." As Thomas moved aside, Carol watched him with the mild curiosity reserved for inconveniences that might become stories later. She noticed his shoes. Sensible. Expensive once, but well cared for. She noticed the way other staff avoided his eyes, the way a uniformed supervisor paused mid-step when he passed, then continued walking as if nothing had happened. Boarding resumed. The line surged forward. Carol scanned her pass and stepped through, satisfied, already composing an email in her head about inefficiency and oversight. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and dry. Overhead bins clicked shut. The low murmur of people settling in filled the space like distant surf. Carol slid into her seat, stowed her bag, and glanced out the window at the grey morning. The plane felt older than she remembered. Solid, heavy, built in a different era. In the galley, a flight attendant whispered to another, her hand half covering her mouth. That was him. The other frowned. Who? The guy at the gate, Thomas Reed. The second attendant stiffened. No, he retired. So did everyone think, the first said. That's him. Up front, the captain's door opened. Captain Mark Sullivan stepped out, silver hair visible beneath his cap, eyes scanning the cabin with practiced calm. A purser leaned in, murmuring something that made his expression change. Not alarm, recognition. Captain Sullivan nodded once. "Hold boarding," he said. "Now!" The chime sounded. Conversations paused. Carol looked up, annoyed. The purser's voice came over the intercom, measured but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we require a brief pause in boarding. Thank you for your patience." At the gate, Thomas Reed stood alone near the window, watching ground crew move with the slow precision of people who had done this their entire lives. A young security officer approached, nervous energy in his steps. "Sir," he said, "may I see your identification again?" Thomas handed it over without comment. The officer's eyes moved across the card. His posture shifted. He swallowed. "I'll need to make a call," the officer said. "Of course," Thomas replied. Inside the cabin, Carol shifted in her seat. The delay stretched. A man across the aisle muttered about connections. A woman 2 rows up closed her eyes and breathed through impatience. Then Captain Sullivan's voice returned, this time without the practiced cheer. "Lady and gentlemen," he said, "we appreciate your patience. Before we continue, I need to address a procedural matter." The aisle lights seemed brighter, the air tighter. "At this time," the captain continued, "we are verifying an internal security and compliance protocol." Carol frowned. She felt something cold settle at the base of her neck. The captain stepped fully into the aisle now, visible to all. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, until it found the empty space near the front, where one seat remained unoccupied. "We will resume boarding shortly," he said. "Thank you." At the gate, Thomas Reed was handed his identification back with both hands. "We're very sorry, sir," the supervisor said, voice low. "There was an outdated flag in the system. It should never have been active." Thomas nodded once. "It happens," he said. "No," the supervisor replied. "It shouldn't." As Thomas stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft deepened, a living thing waiting. He paused halfway down, hand resting lightly on the rail, eyes closing for a brief moment. The envelope in his pocket pressed against his chest. Inside the cabin, Carol felt it before she saw it. A shift. A subtle straightening of backs. The way people quiet when something unspoken enters the room. Thomas Reed appeared at the doorway, not hurried, not triumphant, just present. Captain Sullivan met him at the threshold. The 2 men exchanged a look heavy with shared history. The captain extended his hand. Thomas shook it. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reed," the captain said. Not loud, but everyone heard it. Carol's breath caught. The name echoed, connecting dots she had not known were there. Reed. The reports. The congressional hearings. The restructuring years ago that saved 3 airlines from collapse. Thomas moved down the aisle. Eyes followed him now. Not with suspicion, with recalibration. When he reached his seat directly across from Carol, he paused. He glanced at her. Really looked this time. She saw the lines around his eyes, the tired kindness there, the weight of decades measured in decisions. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Words felt suddenly inadequate. Thomas sat. The seatbelt clicked. Solid. Final. As the door closed and the plane began to push back, Carol stared straight ahead, heart beating faster than it had in years. She realized, with a clarity that stung, that the shock had not been the delay, or the inconvenience, or even the name. It was the quiet certainty with which he had accepted being told no, and the unsettling thought that some people do not raise their voices because they do not need to. The cabin did not return to its normal rhythm after Thomas Reed sat down. People pretended it had. Pages turned, screens lit up. A flight attendant offered water with a smile that was a fraction too careful. But the air itself felt altered, as if the plane had inhaled and not yet decided whether to exhale. Carol Henley kept her hands folded in her lap. She could feel her pulse there, insistent, betraying her calm posture. She told herself she was imagining things, that names carried echoes and nothing more. but she had been in too many boardrooms not to recognize the moment when power entered quietly and rearranged the furniture without touching a thing. Thomas adjusted the cuff of his shirt. The fabric was soft from age, not luxury. He rested his hands on the armrests and stared forward, expression neutral, breathing slow. To anyone watching, he was just another older man settling in for a long flight. Inside, his thoughts moved elsewhere. He remembered the letter in his pocket, the reason he had taken this flight instead of the company jet, the reason he had allowed the flag to remain active in the system, despite knowing it would cause friction. There were things you could not audit from reports. There were truths that only surfaced when no one knew who you were. A flight attendant stopped beside him, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a practiced smile. Her name tag read Diane. She hesitated before speaking, the way people did when instinct warred with protocol. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, "may I get you anything?" "Coffee," he replied. "Black. When you have a moment." She nodded, relief flickering across her face, and moved on. Across the aisle, Carol watched the exchange. "Mr. Reed." The captain had said it the same way, with weight, with familiarity. Her mind replayed old headlines, mergers, bailouts, Senate testimonies broadcast on muted televisions in airport lounges. Thomas Reed had been there, always in the background, never courting attention, never smiling for cameras. The man who stepped in when companies were already bleeding out and made decisions no one wanted to make. She had assumed he was retired. Everyone had. That was the story. The seatbelt sign chimed off. A few people stood. Overhead bins opened with dull thuds. Carol remained seated. She felt unmoored, like the ground beneath her assumptions had shifted without warning. Thomas took out a slim notebook, the cover cracked at the spine. He opened it to a page already half filled with neat handwriting. Dates, times, short phrases. He added a line, paused, then closed it again. Diane returned with the coffee. She set it down carefully, her hand lingering a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "I'm sorry about earlier," she said under her breath. "At the gate." Thomas looked at her then, really looked. He saw the tension she carried in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened when she waited for a reaction. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "I know you were following what you were given." She nodded, swallowing. "It's not always clear what we're supposed to do." "No," Thomas said. "It isn't." She moved on, blinking faster than before. The plane leveled out. The engines settled into a steady hum. Sunlight filtered through the windows in pale bands, illuminating dust motes drifting in the air. Carol finally spoke. "I didn't realize," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "At the gate." Thomas turned his head slightly. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply acknowledged her presence. "Most people don't," he said. She waited for more. None came. The silence stretched. Not hostile, not forgiving. Just there. Carol exhaled slowly. "I've been flying this route for years," she said. "I've never seen a clearance stopped like that." Thomas nodded once. "Systems remember longer than people do." She frowned, unsure what to make of that. "Do you always travel this way?" "When I need to see what everyone else sees," he said. Carol's fingers tightened around her armrest. She felt something uncomfortable rise in her chest. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. She had spent a career navigating systems designed to favor people like her. She knew their blind spots. She had benefited from them without ever needing to name them. "I suppose you could have made a call," she said, "avoided all that." Thomas looked forward again. "I could have," he agreed. The way he said it told her he had chosen not to. A few rows back, a man leaned into his companion, whispering. Another passenger glanced repeatedly toward the front, curiosity giving way to speculation. The name had traveled. It always did. In the cockpit, Captain Sullivan sat with his hands resting lightly on the controls, eyes forward. The message from headquarters still echoed in his mind. The apology, the instruction, the reminder that certain protocols existed for a reason. He had flown under Thomas Reed's leadership years ago, back when the airline had been something else entirely. Leaner, meaner, closer to collapse than anyone liked to admit. Reed had not raised his voice then, either. He had simply asked questions that could not be ignored. The flight attendant call light chimed. Diane glanced at it, then at Thomas, then back at the light. She hesitated before continuing down the aisle. Carol shifted again. She felt the urge to fill the quiet, to reassert the version of herself that knew how to speak, how to smooth over tension. "I'm on my way to San Francisco for a board meeting," she said. "Investment committee." Thomas acknowledged this with a slight tilt of his head. 40 years in," Carol continued. "You'd think I'd be used to uncertainty by now." "Experience doesn't remove it," Thomas said. "It just teaches you where it hides." She let out a small breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "You sound like my father." Thomas glanced at her. "What did he do?" "He was a machinist," Carol said. "Union shop. Never trusted executives." "And yet," Thomas said gently, "here you are." She felt the comment land, not as a jab, but as an observation. She did not respond. Hours passed in small movements. Meal trays, quiet conversations, the soft thump of footsteps on carpet. Thomas read for a while, then closed his book and stared out the window at the endless blue. Carol watched him in her peripheral vision. The ease with which others deferred to him now, the way the crew checked in without hovering. She thought about the envelope she had seen him hold at the gate, the way he had put it back as if it was something fragile. Eventually she spoke again, more carefully this time. "You didn't have to sit here," she said. "After everything." Thomas considered her words. "Seats are just seats," he said. "What matters is how people behave when they think they're not being observed." The phrase settled between them, heavy and unadorned. Carol nodded slowly. She felt older than she had that morning. Not diminished, just stripped of something she had worn without noticing. The plane continued west, steady and indifferent, carrying with it a quiet reckoning that had only just begun. The first jolt hit without warning, not the gentle ripple of air that made glasses tremble, but a sharp, sideways shove that snapped heads up and pulled breath from chests. The cabin lights flickered once. Somewhere behind them, a bag fell from an overhead bin and struck the aisle with a hollow crack. The seatbelt sign chimed back on, loud and insistent. Carol Henley's hand shot to the armrest before she realized she had moved. Her pulse spiked, fast and shallow, the way it always did when control slipped away from her fingers. The plane dipped again, harder this time, the floor seeming to drop while the ceiling pressed closer. A murmur rose through the cabin, low, uneasy. Thomas Reed did not reach for anything. He remained still, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward, his breath deepening instead of shortening. He had felt turbulence before, worse than this. Enough to know that panic multiplied damage faster than any mechanical failure ever could. Another drop. A woman across the aisle gasped, her voice breaking. Someone laughed too loudly, a brittle sound that collapsed into silence. Carol swallowed. The careful poise she carried into courtrooms and boardrooms deserted her with humiliating speed. Her stomach clenched. Her vision narrowed. The plane shuddered as if shrugging off an invisible weight. "This isn't normal," she whispered. Not to Thomas, not to anyone, but to the space in front of her. Thomas turned his head slightly. "It's uncomfortable," he said, "not dangerous." She stared at him, eyes wide, searching his face for certainty the way a child searched an adult's when thunder cracked too close. He did not offer comfort with touch or platitudes. He simply met her gaze, steady and grounded. The aircraft lurched again, harder. A sharp intake of breath tore from Carol's chest. Her nails bit into the armrest, knuckles whitening. "I don't like this," she said, her voice thin now, stripped of authority. "I really don't like this." Thomas nodded. "Most people don't." The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm, every syllable measured. He spoke of unexpected air currents, of altitude changes, of crews trained for exactly this. The words flowed, practiced and reassuring, but Carol barely heard them. Her attention tunneled inward, tracking each jolt, each vibration. The plane dropped again, fast enough to lift her stomach into her throat. She let out a short, involuntary cry, then clamped her mouth shut, embarrassed by her own fear. Thomas shifted then, just slightly. He placed both feet flat on the floor, grounded himself, and closed his eyes for a moment. "Breathe with me," he said quietly. She shook her head, breath coming too fast. "I can't." "You can," he replied. "In through your nose, slow. Count if you need to." She did not want to listen. She did not want to follow instructions from a man she had dismissed hours earlier. But another violent shudder left her trembling, and instinct overrode pride. She inhaled, shallow at first, then deeper. She followed his pace, unconsciously matching the rise and fall of his chest. Outside the window, the sky had darkened. Sunlight gave way to thick grey cloud, the horizon swallowed whole. The engines roared louder, working harder, the sound raw and close. "I hate this," Carol said again, the words tumbling out now. "I hate not knowing. I hate not being able to fix it." Thomas opened his eyes. "Control is comforting," he said. "It's also mostly an illusion." She let out a breath that bordered on a sob. "That's easy for you to say." He did not bristle. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The turbulence persisted, relentless, the kind that refused to settle into a pattern. Trays rattled, overhead bins creaked. The cabin felt smaller with every jolt. Carol's thoughts spiraled. Headlines, meetings, decisions she had forced through sheer will. She had built a life on momentum and command, on the belief that if she pushed hard enough, things would bend. The plane did not bend. "I'm supposed to be in charge," she said suddenly. The confession slipped out, raw and unfiltered. "All the time. People expect it. If I hesitate, they smell it." Thomas listened, truly listened. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to reassure. "And what happens," he asked calmly, "when you can't be?" Her throat tightened. "Then you pretend," she said. "You pretend harder." Another drop punctuated her words, sharp enough to draw gasps from nearby rows. Carol flinched, then pressed her lips together, breathing through her nose as Thomas had shown her. "I've spent decades making sure no one sees me like this," she continued, voice shaking but steadier now. "Weak, uncertain." Thomas considered her profile, the tension in her jaw, the carefully maintained exterior cracking under pressure. "Strength isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's what you do when fear shows up uninvited." She glanced at him, startled by the absence of judgment in his tone. "And what do you do?" "I pay attention," he replied. "Fear is information." The plane jolted again, but something in Carol shifted. The panic did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. Her breaths lengthened, her shoulders dropped a fraction. Minutes stretched, then more. The turbulence continued, but its edges softened, the drops less violent, the shuddering less severe. The seatbelt sign remained lit, but the cabin noise eased. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. A flight attendant moved cautiously down the aisle, checking belts, offering water with a steady smile that masked her own nerves. Diane paused beside them. She looked at Carol, then at Thomas. "You both doing okay?" she asked. Carol nodded, surprised to realize she meant it. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Diane smiled, genuine this time, and moved on. Silence settled between Carol and Thomas. Not awkward, not strained, just quiet. Eventually, the captain's voice returned, announcing smoother air ahead. Apologies were offered. Gratitude expressed. The seatbelt sign chimed off again, softer now, less urgent. A collective exhale rippled through the cabin. Carol leaned back, exhaustion washing over her in a heavy wave. She closed her eyes, feeling the residual tremor in her hands fade. "Thank you," she said after a moment. Not loudly, not performatively. "For that." Thomas nodded. "You're welcome." She hesitated, then added, "I don't usually let people see that side of me." "I know," he said. She opened her eyes, studying him. "How?" "Because you worked very hard to hide it," Thomas replied. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. For a brief stretch of time, the space between them felt altered, stripped of earlier assumptions and missteps. Carol felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not absolution, not forgiveness. Perspective. Then habit returned, as habits always did. She straightened in her seat, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her jacket. She reached for her bag, pulling out her tablet, the familiar glow of documents and numbers offering a refuge she understood. "Well," she said, composure sliding back into place. "Back to work." Thomas watched the transformation without comment. He recognized it. He had seen it in executives, regulators, senators. The armor rebuilt once the immediate threat passed. He reached into his pocket and felt the envelope there, its edges worn smooth. He did not take it out, not yet. Outside, the clouds thinned, sunlight breaking through in narrow bands that painted the wing in pale gold. The plane continued west, steady once more, carrying two people who had shared a moment of unguarded truth, and who now retreated to opposite sides of themselves, as if it had never happened. The calm did not last. It never did. An hour after the turbulence eased, the cabin lights dimmed to their late afternoon setting. That soft, amber glow meant to lull bodies into rest. Most passengers sank into screens or sleep. Trays were cleared. The aircraft settled into a smooth, confident rhythm, as if the earlier violence had been an unpleasant dream. Carol Henley stared at her tablet without reading a single line. Numbers blurred. Sentences repeated themselves without meaning. Her reflection stared back faintly from the darkened screen, older than it had been that morning. Not weaker, just exposed. She locked the tablet and slid it back into her bag with more force than necessary. Across the aisle, Thomas Reed sat with his hands folded loosely, eyes closed, not sleeping, waiting. The flight attendant call light chimed again, this time from the row behind them. A man's voice followed, sharp, irritated. "I've been waiting 10 minutes." Diane stopped beside the seat, posture immediately alert. "I'm sorry, sir. How can I help?" "I asked for a blanket," the man said, "and I don't see why that's difficult." He was mid-50s, crisp blazer, watch worn loose on the wrist. The kind of man who leaned back too far in chairs, testing boundaries. Diane nodded, already turning to retrieve one. "And another thing," he added, voice rising just enough to draw attention. "I paid for this seat. I expect service." Diane froze for a fraction of a second. "Of course," she said carefully. "I'll be right back." "I don't think you heard me," the man snapped. "I expect..." "That's enough!" The word cut cleanly through the aisle. Thomas Reed had opened his eyes. The man blinked, surprised. "Excuse me." "You were heard," Thomas said calmly. "She acknowledged you. Let her do her job." Carol felt the shift immediately. Heads turned. The air tightened again, different this time. Focused. The man scoffed. "Mind your business." Thomas did not raise his voice. "I am." Diane stood very still, hands clasped, eyes flicking between them. "I don't appreciate being lectured by another passenger," the man continued, "especially one who isn't crew." Thomas nodded once. Understood. He reached up and pressed the call button himself. Diane's eyes widened slightly. Moments later, Mark Reynolds appeared from the galley, expression professional, jaw set. He took in the scene with one practiced glance. "What seems to be the issue?" Mark asked. The man launched in immediately, gesturing. "This passenger is interfering. I made a simple request and was spoken to disrespectfully." Mark turned to Thomas. "Sir." Thomas met his gaze. "Your attendant handled the request appropriately. The escalation came from the passenger, not the crew." Mark inhaled slowly. "Thank you." He turned back to the man. "Sir, I'll ask you to lower your voice. We're happy to assist, but we expect respectful communication." The man stared at him, incredulous. "Do you know who I am?" Carol felt her stomach drop. She had heard that sentence before, too many times. Mark did not flinch. "I know where you're seated," he said evenly. "And I know our policy." The man laughed, sharp and humorless. "This airline is unbelievable." Thomas watched closely now, eyes intent, posture still relaxed. He was no longer a passenger observing an inconvenience. He was evaluating. The man waved a dismissive hand. "Forget it. I'll file a complaint." Mark nodded. "You're entitled to do that." The man leaned back, satisfied, as if he had won something. Diane returned moments later with the blanket, setting it gently on his lap. He did not thank her. As Mark stepped away, his gaze flicked to Thomas, brief but charged. A silent exchange passed between them, one born of shared understanding rather than familiarity. Carol released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thomas closed his eyes again. She turned toward him, voice low. "You didn't have to step in." "No," he said. "I wanted to." She studied his profile. "Why?" "Because patterns repeat," he replied. "And because silence can be read as permission." The words landed harder than she expected. Minutes passed. The cabin resumed its fragile equilibrium. But something fundamental had shifted. Thomas reached into his coat and finally removed the envelope. He did not open it. He simply held it for a moment, thumb tracing the softened crease. Carol noticed. "That looks important." "It is," he said. She waited. "It's a letter from the board," Thomas continued, "written before this flight." Her chest tightened. "About what?" "About stepping back," he said. "About succession. About legacy." She nodded slowly. She understood those conversations. The language of exits disguised as transitions. "They think I've gone quiet," Thomas added, "that I've lost my edge." "And have you?" Carol asked carefully. He looked at her then, eyes clear. "No. I've refined it." The plane hummed steadily, a constant beneath their words. "The truth," Thomas said, "is that organizations don't fail because of bad people. They fail because good people are taught to look away." Carol thought of Diane's tight smile, of Mark's careful phrasing, of herself at the gate, impatient, dismissive. "That's why you're here," she said. Not a question, a realization. "Yes." The word carried weight. Carol leaned back, gaze drifting toward the window. The sky had opened fully now, endless blue stretching beyond the wing. She felt smaller than she had that morning. Not insignificant, just placed in proper proportion. "You're testing more than procedures," she said quietly. "You're testing character." Thomas nodded. "And what happens," she asked, "if you don't like what you see?" He folded the envelope and slipped it back into his pocket. "Then I do something about it." The announcement for initial descent crackled over the speakers. The cabin stirred. Belts were checked. Seats straightened. As the plane began its slow, deliberate tilt downward, Carol felt a familiar tension return. But it was different now. Less frantic. More aware. She turned to Thomas once more.
"Earlier," she said, "at the gate."
He waited. "I saw what I wanted to see," she admitted. "Not what was there." Thomas did not soften. He did not absolve her. He simply acknowledged the truth of it. "So did many people," he said. The city began to emerge beneath them, roads like threads, buildings rising in clusters of steel and glass. A place of power, of consequence. Carol watched it approach, understanding with sudden clarity that the flight had not been the test. It had been the introduction, and whatever waited on the ground would not be handled quietly. The wheels touched down with a muted thud that rippled through the cabin, followed by the long, controlled roar of reverse thrust. The plane slowed, steady and deliberate, as if even the landing refused to be dramatic after everything that had already unfolded. Applause scattered briefly, then died out. Seatbelts clicked. People stood too early, reaching for bags, eager to put the flight behind them. The city rose beyond the windows, austere and intention, waiting with its usual indifference. Thomas Reed remained seated until the seatbelt sign chimed off. He did not rush. He never did. He reached for his coat, slid it on with unhurried movements, then stood, giving the aisle space to those ahead of him. Carol Henley hesitated, then followed. In the jet bridge, the air was warmer, heavier. The hum of the terminal pressed in, voices overlapping, footsteps echoing against concrete and glass. A uniformed operations manager stood just beyond the aircraft door, posture straight, eyes fixed. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly, stepping forward. "Welcome back." The word "back" carried more meaning than the greeting itself. Thomas inclined his head. "Thank you, Angela." Carol slowed, caught just behind them, close enough to hear, far enough to pretend she wasn't listening. She watched as the manager gestured toward a side corridor, discreet, marked only by a small sign. Restricted access. "We have a car waiting," Angela continued, "and security is prepared to escort you through." "That won't be necessary," Thomas said. "I'll walk." Angela blinked, then nodded. "Of course." As Thomas moved away, Carol felt the full weight of realization settle into her chest. Not shock, not humiliation. Something quieter, more durable. She stepped into the main terminal with the rest of the passengers, the familiar churn of arrivals swallowing her whole. No escort, no pause. Just another traveler re-entering the current. She glanced back once. Thomas did not look her way. Customs passed in a blur. Questions answered automatically. Bags collected. The terminal doors slid open, releasing her into the sharp afternoon air. The city smelled like rain and exhaust, ambition layered over old concrete. Her phone vibrated. A message from her assistant. "Urgent. Board meeting moved up. Call me as soon as you land." Carol stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "On my way." She slid into the back of a waiting car, gave the address, and leaned her head against the window. The flight replayed in fragments. The gate, the turbulence. The way Thomas had spoken to Diane. The envelope. By the time she reached her office tower, the disquiet had not faded. It had deepened. 3 days later, the call came. It was early, too early. The kind of early that made bad news feel inevitable. Carol stood at her kitchen counter, coffee untouched, watching the city wake up below her windows. "Carol," her managing partner said, voice tight, "we need to talk." She closed her eyes. "I'm listening." "The airline," he continued, "Liberty Air. They've requested a pause on all active engagements." Her stomach dropped. A pause. "They're citing a review of external council alignment, culture, conduct." Carol's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "Based on what?" There was a pause. Too long. "Based on an incident," he said carefully. "On one of their flights." The room seemed to tilt. "They've asked for a meeting," he added. "Without you." Silence stretched between them. "Understood," Carol said finally. She hung up and stood very still. The city below looked unchanged. Cars moved, people hurried. Nothing acknowledged the fracture opening inside her. The meeting took place the following week. A long table, neutral walls, polite faces. No raised voices, no accusations. Just facts presented in measured tones. Thomas Reed sat at the far end, hands folded, listening more than speaking. When he did speak, it was precise, detached, final. "This is not punitive," he said. "It is corrective." Carol was not present. She did not need to be. She already knew the outcome. The firm announced her departure quietly. No press release, no spectacle. Just a carefully worded internal memo citing differences in judgment and risk exposure. Colleagues avoided her eyes as she cleared out her office. Some looked apologetic, others relieved. A few looked afraid, as if proximity might prove contagious. She packed her things into a single box. Awards, photos. A career condensed into manageable weight. As she rode the elevator down, she felt something loosen. Not grief, not yet. Just the release of a tension she had carried for decades without naming. The months that followed were not redemptive. They were disorienting. Days without schedules, nights without emails, friends who stopped calling, invitations that dried up. Carol tried consulting. The work felt hollow. She tried advising startups. The pace exhausted her. Eventually, she found herself sitting in a small, crowded office in a part of the city she rarely visited, listening to a woman explain how her landlord had locked her out of her apartment without notice. Carol took notes, asked questions, filed paperwork. The work was unglamorous, necessary, immediate. It did not make her feel better. Not at first. But it made her feel present. One evening, long after the office had emptied, she sat alone, staring at a stack of files. Names she did not recognize. Lives she could not afford to ignore. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She considered letting it go, then answered. "Miss Henley," a man said. His voice was familiar. "Yes, this is Thomas Reed." Her breath caught, sharp and involuntary. "I wanted you to know," he continued, "that the review is complete." She waited, heart pounding. "The firm has addressed the issues," Thomas said. "The corrective measures are in place." She nodded, though he could not see it. "Thank you for telling me." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, intentional. "You've changed your work," he said. "Yes," Carol replied. "I had to." Another pause. "That matters," Thomas said. The line went dead. Carol sat there for a long time afterward, phone still in her hand. No absolution had been offered. None had been requested. Outside, the city pulsed on, indifferent and relentless. Carol returned to her files. She read. She listened. she worked. Somewhere above, planes crossed invisible paths, carrying people who believed their choices ended when the doors opened. She knew better now. The flight had ended. The consequences had not. The town hall began without fanfare. No music, no sweeping introduction. Just a plain screen lowered in crew lounges and operations centers across the country, the image steady and unadorned. Thomas Reed stood behind a simple podium, jacket off, sleeves buttoned at the wrist, posture relaxed in a way that drew people in rather than held them at bay. He waited until the last room checked in. Then he spoke. "I'm not here to talk about a flight," he said. "I'm here to talk about what happens when rules collide with fear." Across terminals and offices, people leaned forward. Mechanics wiped their hands on rags. Gate agents paused mid-shift. Pilots listened from jump seats and kitchen tables. Thomas did not raise his voice. He never did. "Policies are easy to write," he continued. "They are much harder to live inside, especially when someone with status decides they do not apply." He described the gate delay without names, the cabin exchange without accusations, the way pressure flowed downhill until it settled on the shoulders least equipped to carry it. "In those moments," he said, "the organization reveals itself." Diane watched from the break room, arms folded, jaw tight. She recognized the cadence of the story, the pauses where her own breath had caught, the silence she had chosen because she thought it was safer. When Thomas finished, there was no applause, just a collective stillness. The memo followed the next morning. Clear language, no euphemisms. A revised authority protocol that removed ambiguity and replaced it with something sturdier. Crew discretion codified. Escalation paths simplified. Protection promised and enforced. Managers were required to sign it, not electronically, in person. Mark Reynolds read it twice, then once more. He felt both relieved and exposed. The document named the hesitation he had rationalized for years, the cost of trying to please everyone. He signed. The changes rippled outward. Training sessions were rewritten, scenarios rehearsed, language sharpened. The word tolerate disappeared from the manual, replaced by enforce. Passengers noticed without understanding why. A different tone, a steadier hand. Boundaries that did not bend under pressure. Thomas watched from a distance. He did not attend the sessions, he did not hover. He let the system move on its own, the way it was meant to. Carol Henley learned about the changes the same way she learned most things now, from the edges. A volunteer coordinator mentioned it offhand while reviewing intake forms. A pilot, she once advised, referenced the memo during a lunch break, his tone respectful, almost grateful. Carol nodded and returned to her work. Her days had taken on a different rhythm, slower, more deliberate. She spent hours listening to stories that did not resolve neatly, people whose problems could not be fixed with a signature or a call. It unsettled her. It grounded her. Some nights she dreamed of the flight. Not the turbulence, the quiet moments. The way Thomas had sat without bracing, without flinching. She did not reach out again. Neither did he. Months passed. The airline stabilized in ways analysts did not fully understand. Customer satisfaction ticked upward. Staff turnover dropped. Complaints shifted in tone, fewer about disrespect, more about logistics. Thomas stepped back from daily operations. Not entirely, never entirely, but enough to let others lead. The board revisited succession with a different urgency. This time, Thomas listened without resistance. He named his conditions: culture before numbers, authority without cruelty, accountability without spectacle. They agreed. On a grey afternoon, Carol received an email from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, just a single paragraph. There was a hearing scheduled at the municipal building downtown. A zoning dispute tied to an airport expansion. Residents facing displacement. The city needed counsel with experience in regulatory frameworks and corporate negotiations. Her name had been suggested. Carol stared at the screen. She felt the old reflex stir, the urge to calculate advantage, to assess visibility. She closed the laptop. Then she reopened it and replied with her availability. The hearing room was small and crowded. Folding chairs, scuffed floors. A judge who listened more than he spoke. Carol presented her argument without flourish. She cited precedent. She acknowledged constraints. She centered people rather than outcomes. When she finished, she felt something unfamiliar. Peace. In the back of the room, Thomas Reed sat unnoticed. He had not come for her. He had come for the process, for the way institutions treated those who could not afford to wait them out. He watched Carol move through the room afterward, quiet, unassuming, gathering papers rather than praise. He did not approach her. Outside, the air smelled of rain. Planes passed overhead, their paths intersecting without conflict. Thomas walked toward his car. He felt no satisfaction, no vindication, only confirmation. Back at Liberty Air headquarters, Diane received her promotion letter. Not because of the flight, not because of visibility, because she had learned to hold her ground. She taped the memo to her locker, not the signature page, the paragraph about dignity. Carol returned to her small office that evening, the light flickering once before settling. She sat at her desk, hands resting on a stack of files that no one else wanted. She thought of the life she had lost, the one she was building. Somewhere between them, she realized, was the truth she had been avoiding all along. Power did not vanish when she lost her title. It simply stopped answering to her name. The city darkened outside her window. Somewhere above, a plane cut a clean line through the clouds, steady and unremarkable. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, a scent Carol Henley had once associated with leverage and victory. Now, it simply felt neutral, honest. The room was smaller than she expected, the ceiling low, the benches worn smooth by decades of waiting bodies. She took her seat at the narrow table, smoothing the sleeves of her jacket out of habit, then stopping herself. The habit no longer served her. She placed her hands flat instead, grounding herself in the cool wood. Behind her, people whispered. Families, tenants, a few city staffers shifting through binders. No one looked at her with recognition. No one knew who she used to be. Across the room, attorneys for the development firm arranged their papers with brisk efficiency. They were younger, sharper in the way hunger made people sharp. Carol recognized the posture immediately. She had once trained people to sit like that. The judge entered without ceremony. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. The rhythm felt almost intimate. Carol rose when it was her turn to speak. She did not project. She did not perform. Her voice carried because the room was listening, not because she forced it to. She spoke of zoning language and statutory intent, but she spoke first of impact, of families who had lived within a few blocks of the airport for generations, of notices delivered without explanation, of power exercised quietly, assuming no resistance would materialize. The opposing counsel objected twice. The judge waved him off once, sustained him the second time. Carol adjusted without missing a beat. In the back row, Thomas Reed sat with his hands folded loosely, his presence unremarkable to everyone except himself. He had come without staff, without notice. He had read the filings, traced the funding lines, followed the same instincts that had guided him for decades. The project had been flagged internally weeks ago. Not illegal, not yet, but careless in the way speed often was. He watched Carol move through the argument, noting what she did not do as much as what she did. No grandstanding, no shortcuts. She allowed the facts to breathe. When she finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than necessary. The judge cleared his throat, made a note, and recessed for deliberation. People stood, stretched, murmured. Carol returned to her seat, exhaling slowly, the tension draining from her shoulders. She felt him before she saw him. Thomas did not approach. He stood several feet away, giving her space, eyes focused on the exit, as if waiting for the right moment to become visible. Carol noticed the outline first, the familiar stillness, the sense of gravity without force. She turned. Their eyes met. No shock this time, no recalibration, just recognition. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly. "Miss Henley," he replied. They stood there, the noise of the room washing around them, neither stepping forward, neither retreating. "You were here," Carol said. "Yes." She nodded once. "For the case?" "For the process," Thomas corrected gently. A corner of her mouth lifted, then settled. "Of course." The judge returned. Everyone took their seats again. The ruling was concise. The injunction granted. Further review ordered. The development stalled, its momentum checked. A murmur rippled through the room. Relief, gratitude, the kind that did not know where to land yet. Carol closed her folder. Her hands were steady. Outside the courtroom, people clustered around her, thanking her, asking questions. She answered what she could, deferred what she couldn't. She did not look back. Thomas waited until the hallway cleared. "You argued well," he said. "Thank you." He studied her for a moment, not unkindly. "You're different." "So are you," Carol replied. He considered that. Perhaps. They walked together toward the exit, footsteps echoing softly. "The board approved the expansion," Thomas said. "With conditions." Carol did not react. "And you're here because—" "Because conditions mean nothing if they're enforced without integrity." She stopped walking. He did the same. "You didn't intervene," she said. "No." "You could have." "Yes." She met his gaze. "You didn't." "I didn't need to," Thomas said. "You handled it." The acknowledgement landed quietly, without ceremony. It carried weight, nonetheless. They stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky low and grey. Planes moved overhead, distant and constant.
"I didn't change because of you," Carol said after a moment.
"Not directly." Thomas nodded. "Change rarely has a single cause." "I changed because I finally ran out of places to hide," she continued. "Because the version of myself I built stopped working." Thomas watched traffic move along the street, the rhythm of a city mid-afternoon. "That happens," he said. "If we're lucky." She glanced at him. "Lucky?" "Yes," he said. "Some people never feel the friction. They coast until the end." They stood in silence, the kind that no longer needed filling. "I received a notice," Carol said eventually. "About a grant." Thomas did not look at her. "You did?" "No name attached," she added. "Names can complicate things." She nodded. "Thank you." "For what?" "For trusting the work," she said. "Not the reputation." He turned to her then. "Reputation is a shadow," he said. "Work is the substance." A car pulled up to the curb. Not a black sedan, something ordinary. Thomas opened the door, paused. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But if you ever decide you're done fighting at the margins, let me know." Carol considered the offer. Not the power behind it, the implication. "I'm not done where I am," she said. Thomas smiled. "Just barely." "Good." He stepped into the car. The door closed softly. The vehicle pulled away, swallowed by traffic. Carol remained on the sidewalk, the sound of the city pressing in around her. She felt no urge to chase, no sense of loss. She turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward her office, toward the files waiting on her desk. Above her, another plane passed overhead, steady and precise, moving along a path laid down long before either of them had noticed. For once, she was content to let it fly, without trying to control where it landed. The letter arrived without a logo, no embossed seal, no executive assistant's name at the bottom, just a plain envelope, thick enough to feel deliberate, addressed in clean block letters that suggested someone who still believed handwriting mattered. Carol Henley held it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single page and a packet clipped behind it. The page was brief. Liberty Air was restructuring its community engagement and compliance oversight. An independent advisory council was being formed. The council would have no branding value, no press announcements, no ceremonial launch. Its mandate was narrow and uncomfortable. Review, question, interrupt when necessary. Her name appeared once, not as an offer, as a request. Carol sat back in her chair, the old wooden one that creaked when she leaned too far. Outside her office window, a bus groaned to a stop, doors hissing open, people climbing in with the resignation of routine. The city moved, whether she decided or not. She read the page again. The packet beneath it was heavier. Case summaries, internal memos, incident reports stripped of names. Patterns emerged quickly. Not corruption, not villainy. Something harder to fight. Convenience. Deference. The slow erosion of responsibility in the presence of power. Carol felt the familiar pull, the part of her that once sharpened itself on complexity, that enjoyed stepping into systems others avoided. She also felt something else, a hesitation born not of fear, but of honesty. She closed the folder. That evening, she walked the long way home, past the courthouse, past the small park where people sat on benches pretending not to watch each other. A plane passed overhead, low enough that she could see the underbelly, the landing gear retracted, the lights steady. She stopped walking. For years, she had believed proximity to power was the same thing as purpose. The flight had taken that illusion apart, piece by piece. What remained was quieter, more demanding. Her phone buzzed, a message from the legal clinic. A tenant had been served a notice that afternoon. Lockout scheduled for the end of the week. They needed help filing an emergency stay. Carol typed back immediately. "I'll be there in the morning." She slipped the envelope back into her bag and kept walking. The advisory council convened without her. Thomas Reed sat at the table alone the first day, reading through reports while the city hummed outside the glass walls. He did not mind the empty chairs. They were honest. Participation had to be chosen. He closed one folder and opened another. This one, older, yellowed. A record from years earlier. A whistleblower complaint, dismissed as misunderstanding. A junior staffer whose concerns had been politely acknowledged and quietly buried. Thomas's jaw tightened. He made a note in the margin. Follow-up. Power, he had learned, did not corrupt as much as it distracted. It pulled attention upward, away from the ground where damage actually occurred. He remembered the way Carol had argued in that small courtroom, the way she had framed the issue without centering herself, the way she had not looked for his reaction afterward. He folded the letter copy and set it aside. If she came, she came. If she didn't, the work would continue. 2 weeks passed. Carol spent her days buried in filings and client meetings, her evenings drafting motions at her kitchen table. The work was relentless, uncelebrated, necessary. She slept better than she had in years. On a Thursday afternoon, as she gathered her coat to leave the office, she noticed the envelope again. It had slid partially out of her bag, the corner bent now from use. She stared at it, then reached for her phone. The call connected on the third ring. "This is Thomas Reed," came the familiar voice. "It's Carol," she said. A pause. Not surprised, attentive. "I received your letter," she continued. "I won't be able to commit in the way you're asking." "I understand," Thomas replied. "But," she added, before she could reconsider, "I can give you something else." He waited. "I can tell you where the friction actually is," Carol said. "Not on paper. In practice. I can point out the places your people are taught to hesitate." Another pause. Longer this time. "That would be valuable," Thomas said. "I won't be visible," she added. "I won't be a name you can cite." "I wouldn't ask you to be," he replied. They agreed to meet the following week. No press, no announcement, just a conversation. When Carol arrived at Liberty Air headquarters, she did not go to the executive floor. She was directed instead to a small conference room near operations. Windows overlooked the tarmac. Planes lined up nose to tail, waiting their turn. Thomas was already there, sleeves rolled up, coffee cooling untouched. They did not shake hands. They sat. Carol spoke first. "You have a culture problem," she said calmly. "Not a moral one, a procedural one." Thomas leaned back, listening. "Your people know the rules," she continued. "They don't know when you'll back them." He nodded. "We've addressed authority." "On paper," Carol said. "But authority isn't just permission. It's protection after the fact." She slid a document across the table, a flowchart she had drawn by hand. "Here," she said. "This is where they freeze. Not because they don't know what to do, because they're afraid of being blamed later." Thomas studied the page, slowly. "This," he said finally, tapping the diagram, "is accurate." "I know," Carol replied. "I used to design systems like this, ones that rewarded compliance and punished initiative." He looked up at her. "And now?" "And now I'm trying to undo them," she said. They worked for hours. No posturing, no nostalgia. Just dismantling assumptions, piece by piece. When Carol left, the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and grey. Planes continued to move, lights blinking in measured sequence. Thomas remained in the room long after she was gone, staring at the flowchart on the table. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to relief. Change, he knew, did not come from grand gestures. It came from people willing to sit in uncomfortable rooms and say what others would not. Carol walked toward the train station, tired but steady. The envelope was no longer in her bag. She had made her choice. Not to return to power, but to stand close enough to it to make it answerable. The protest was smaller than the headlines had promised. A few dozen people gathered behind metal barricades, signs hand-lettered, voices earnest but tired. Traffic moved past them without slowing, drivers glancing over and then returning to their phones. The terminal loomed behind glass, indifferent and humming. Carol Henley stood at the edge of the crowd, coat buttoned against the wind, observing rather than participating. She recognized the pattern immediately. Public concern framed as spectacle, contained, managed. Across the street, Liberty Air executives exited black cars and walked briskly toward a side entrance, faces composed, steps synchronized. The city knew how to choreograph power. Carol checked her watch and turned away. Inside a nearby municipal building, the real work was unfolding. A closed-door session. No press, no microphones, just documents spread across a long table and the quiet intensity of people who understood what was at stake. Thomas Reed took his seat at the head of the table, not by title, but by gravity. He had insisted on the location. Neutral ground, public building, no corporate banners. Around him sat city officials, legal counsel, compliance officers, and two community representatives who looked slightly overwhelmed by the formality of it all. Carol sat 3 seats down, anonymous to most, her role undefined by design. Thomas opened the meeting without preamble. "This expansion will move forward," he said evenly. "That is not the question." Several people shifted. "The question," he continued, "is who absorbs the cost." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, focused. A city planner spoke first, outlining timelines and zoning adjustments. A lawyer responded, referencing statutes and mitigation funds. The conversation remained technical, careful to avoid moral language. Carol listened. She waited. When the discussion stalled, looping back on itself, she leaned forward slightly. "There's a blind spot," she said. Heads turned, some curious, some irritated. "You're assuming displacement is a logistical issue," Carol continued. "It isn't. It's a trust issue, and you can't offset broken trust with compensation alone." A developer's attorney frowned. "We've allocated substantial funds." "For relocation," Carol said, "not for continuity. You're moving people, not preserving lives." The room quieted. Thomas watched her closely. Not to intervene, to see who would push back. A city council aide cleared his throat. "What are you suggesting?" Carol did not hesitate. "Phased development, guaranteed right of return, rent stabilization enforced by third-party oversight, not promised, enforced." The attorney scoffed. "That's unrealistic." Carol met his gaze. "So is assuming people will quietly accept erasure." Thomas leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes thoughtful. "This," he said, "is why you're here." The attorney bristled. "Who is she?" "A necessary complication," Thomas replied. The meeting stretched into the afternoon. Arguments sharpened. Concessions extracted inch by inch. By the time they broke, the plan on the table looked nothing like the one that had entered the room. Outside, the protest had thinned. The crowd dispersed, unaware of the shift that had occurred without them. Carol stepped out into the fading light, shoulders tight, mind buzzing. Thomas caught up with her on the steps. "You disrupted their assumptions," he said. "That was the point," Carol replied. "They'll resist," he added. "They always do." He nodded. "But they'll adapt." Carol exhaled slowly. "This doesn't fix everything." "No," Thomas agreed. "But it changes the direction." They stood side by side, watching city workers dismantle barricades across the street. Order restored, appearances maintained. "You've been careful," Carol said, "about not being seen as the force behind this." Thomas smiled faintly. Visibility distorts incentives. "And yet," she said, "you're still here." "Yes," he replied, "because absence creates its own distortions." Her phone buzzed. A message from the clinic. Another eviction notice. Another emergency. "I have to go," Carol said. Thomas nodded. "Of course." She hesitated, then spoke. "You know this will never end. There will always be another meeting, another compromise." "I know," Thomas said. "That's why it can't belong to one person." She studied him. "You're letting go." "I'm distributing," he corrected. They parted without ceremony. That night, Carol worked late, drafting filings by the glow of a single lamp. The city outside her window pulsed and receded, sirens distant, lives intersecting without pause. She thought about the flight, the turbulence, the moment she had lost her footing and found something steadier beneath it. She no longer felt the need to prove anything. Across town, Thomas sat in his apartment, reviewing notes. The flowchart Carol had drawn lay open on the table, now marked with his own annotations, lines adjusted, responsibilities clarified. He paused, pen hovering. For years he had carried the weight of decision alone, believing that restraint equaled responsibility. He was learning, late but not too late, that shared authority required trust he had been slow to grant. The phone rang. "Thomas," came the voice of a board member. "We're concerned about the optics of today." Thomas closed the notebook. "I'm not." A pause. "The press. They'll catch up," he said.
And if they don't, then we're doing something right.
He ended the call and stood, moving to the window. A plane climbed into the night sky, lights blinking in disciplined sequence. He felt no urge to follow it. Weeks passed. The revised plan was approved. Construction resumed under new constraints. The Community Oversight Committee met monthly, its authority real, its teeth visible. Carol attended some meetings, skipped others. She remained where she was most needed, in rooms without cameras. Her name appeared nowhere. That was intentional. One afternoon, as she left the clinic, a woman stopped her on the steps. "My sister lives near the airport," the woman said. She said something changed. They listened this time. Carol smiled. Small. Real. "That's good," she said. The woman hesitated. "Are you part of that?" Carol shook her head. "I am part of the work." The woman nodded, satisfied, and walked away. Carol watched her go, then turned toward the street, the wind tugging at her coat. Above her, another plane traced a line across the sky, steady and sure. She did not look up to follow it. She already knew where she was headed. The winter morning arrived clean and sharp, the kind that made breath visible and thoughts feel precise. Thomas Reed stood at the window of his apartment, coat already on, watching the city stretch awake below him. Traffic moved in deliberate lines. Pedestrians crossed with purpose. Somewhere, engines lifted into the sky, unseen but familiar. He no longer tracked the flights by habit. He trusted the systems now to do what they had been rebuilt to do. On the table behind him lay a single document. Succession finalized. Authority transferred. His name reduced to a line of acknowledgement rather than command. He picked it up, folded it once, and slid it into a drawer. That chapter was complete. Across the city, Carol Henley unlocked the door to the legal clinic just as the sun cleared the rooftops. The lights flickered on, revealing chipped paint, mismatched chairs, stacks of files that never seemed to shrink. She set her bag down and poured coffee into a mug that had lost its logo years ago. Her phone buzzed once. A calendar reminder. Community Oversight Meeting. Noon. She muted it. A man was already waiting in the hallway, hat in his hands, eyes tired but hopeful. Carol smiled and gestured him in. They sat. They talked. Paperwork began its slow, necessary march. By midday, the meeting room downtown filled quietly. No press, no banners, just people taking seats and opening folders. Carol arrived without introduction and took a chair near the middle. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was to clarify, to redirect, to steady. The work moved forward. Thomas did not attend. He spent the afternoon walking through a neighborhood he had once only known through reports. Small businesses, side streets, children playing too close to the curb. He stopped for coffee at a place that did not recognize him and tipped in cash. The barista thanked him without ceremony. That evening, a local paper ran a short article on page 6. No headline worth remembering. Just a paragraph about revised airport development plans and increased community input. No names, no faces. Thomas read it once and set it aside. Carol read it later that night, long after the clinic had closed. She smiled, not at the words, but at what was absent from them. Months passed. Liberty Air stabilized into something quieter, less reactive, more deliberate. Complaints declined. Employee retention climbed. The airline became boring in the best possible way. Analysts speculated. They always did. Thomas ignored them. Carol's world remained small and demanding. Wins came in inches, losses still stung. She learned to accept both without attaching them to her identity. One afternoon, a young attorney asked her how she had learned to navigate systems so well. Carol thought for a moment. "By breaking one," she said simply. The attorney laughed, unsure if it was a joke. Carol did not clarify. On the anniversary of the flight, Thomas boarded a different plane, different airline, middle seat. No flag in the system this time, no test to run. He watched as a gate agent handled a difficult passenger with calm authority, backed by a supervisor who did not hesitate. The situation resolved cleanly, efficiently. Thomas smiled to himself and turned toward the window. Carol spent that same day in court, standing beside a client whose hands shook as she signed a settlement agreement. When it was done, the client hugged her without warning, tears soaking into Carol's jacket. Carol held her until the shaking stopped. That night, she walked home through streets washed clean by rain. The city reflected itself in puddles, distorted but recognizable. She thought briefly of the woman she had been, the one who believed proximity to power was protection, the one who mistook silence for control. She did not miss her. Thomas sat on his balcony as dusk settled, the sky shifting from blue to gray to something softer. He felt no urge to intervene, to correct, to oversee. The world did not require his constant attention anymore. That, he realized, was the measure of success he had been chasing all along. Somewhere below, a plane lifted off, steady and unremarkable, carrying people who would never know the systems beneath them had been changed by choices made quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle. Carol closed her office door and turned off the lights. The files would be there tomorrow. The work would continue. She stepped into the night, with no illusions left to defend. Not every story ended with redemption. Not every mistake earned forgiveness. But some failures, when faced honestly, redirected lives towards something sturdier than success. Thomas Reed and Carol Henley would never be symbols. Their names would fade. Their choices would not. That was enough. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like it, subscribe for more, and leave a comment with what resonated most.